Hi, welcome to my thesis presentation. The title is Design for Obsolete Devices, Exploring the Marginalization of Users of Obsolete Devices Regarding the Swedish Public Services Digitalization. So I'm going to tell a little bit about the background of the project. So it comes from initially from a general concern about the role of interaction design in the generation of obsolescence, initially about the environmental impacts of obsolescence. And I was also interested in the tensions that exist in how technological progress produces the new and the old. And yeah, so I focused on two research questions. So the first one is how might we enable owners of non-smartphones to have access to public services that have been digitalized? And the second one is how might we design public services infrastructures in a way that challenges the obsolescent processes of technological devices? I'm gonna now present a bit of my theoretical background. What is interesting with the word obsolescence is the origins of the term, because the word itself was invented by Bernard London in the context of the Great Depression, where he proposes obsolescence as a solution, actually, to provoke economic growth. And from that, and then we kind of arrive to this very linear vision of the evolution of a product, and by extension, the evolution of technologies, that at some point, when something better arrives on the market, it replaces everything that pre-exists. But actually, this is not really reflecting everything that's happening in practice. Because, for example, there's alternative infrastructures such as repair shops that challenge this linearity of lifespan of products and technologies. And so, to me, this is a very important aspect of the topic of obsolescence in this thesis, because there's the question of why something is perceived as obsolete and for whom. Then how obsolescence is produced. So we could think from a naive perspective that something becomes obsolete because it doesn't work anymore, but the causes of obsolescence are a bit more subtle. So I'm relying here on a study from Elaine Zhang and Kai Fong, where they conducted interviews and surveys with people and asked them the reason for replacing their electronic devices. And the first reason was actually economical. If there was a discount or if their farm contract was being used, they would buy a new device. The second reason was desire for more features and functionalities, just buying a better product. And the third was the breakdown of all dysfunction. So this relates to the hardware malfunctions that Matthias Zayu and Damon Barry present when they propose premature aging as sort of a term for obsolescence, which relates more to a process actually. And they also talk about the consumer society as the environment here that impacts on the aging of products. So what I took from there is that there's an environment that normalizes on one side the exponential consumption and production of technologies. But there's another aspect, which is the isolation of marginalized and discriminated populations. And this is what we're going to talk about right now. So it's what we generally call the digital divide, which is referring to the disparities of access to digital technologies. So what you can see here is that there's 7%, for example, of the US population who don't have access to internet. But if you look at the profiles of these people, you can see that it's mostly elderly people who are touched by the digital divide. But there's also other factors like race, gender, income, or education that are impacting here. There's also what we call the global digital divide, which is the disparities of access to technology at a global scale. So here I'm going to take the example of online education during the coronavirus pandemic, where in a study from the UNESCO, they revealed that only almost half of the global population in the countries where online education was implemented and mandatory in some way, like there was no alternatives. Half of the students couldn't access it. But if you look at certain areas of the world, you can see that, for example, in Western Europe, it's 14% of students who didn't have access to online education, where it's 8% in sub-Saharan Africa. Oops. So what you can see here is that there is a reproduction of the existing discriminatory traits that can be observed in the society. And to me, it's not a coincidence if power structures are reproduced here, because it reflects somehow what's and who matters to the actors that are implementing digital transitions. So I chose to focus on one case study, which is the digitalization of public services in Sweden and the accessibility for offline phone users. So the term digitalization is described by Kristen Lagner as a process of adopting technologies in broader contexts. But what is interesting even more here in this definition is it's interesting to note that she calls it a process. So it's not a result, it's something that is ongoing. Yeah. Alston, but when he's describing digital welfare states, he's talking about the benefits of such digitalization. And the main benefits are economic for the governments, but also for businesses and citizens. He also presents the general concerns, so about this digitalization, which are in terms of surveillance, privacy, and discrimination. And there's also a critique from the service design community, what Sad, Solon, and et al. Call the top-down digitalization, which is, with that term, they critique the illusion of the democratic making and access of digitalized public services. Because actually, as we saw before, there's digital divide that proves that this benefits for some parts of the population and not for the others. About Sweden in particular, so I tried to focus on two different digitalized public services, public technologies related to public services. So the first one is a public transportation app, which is called Scomtrafiken. And the second one is the electronic identification mobile bank ID. So Scomtrafiken is a mobile app that can be used for finding an itinerary, buying tickets, or even finding live information, such as exactly where the bus is right now in the city. So it requires a smartphone, but there's also alternatives for tickets, especially. For example, there's transportation cards, tickets terminals, you can pay with credit card in the buses, but they are more expensive and constraining. And we'll see later the infrastructures in the city. The electronic identification, mobile bank ID, is an authentication for public services like tax agency or public healthcare that is made via smartphone. Yeah. But there's also alternatives to bank ID, to mobile bank ID. There's bank ID on file, bank ID on card, but they require a computer with a recent system version of it. And same for actually the mobile version, which requires quite recent phones. Or system versions. There's also, it's interesting to note on the left side of the screen that there's the shares of the population who don't have a mobile bank ID in Sweden are older generations, which reflects the previous figures we saw before about digital divide. So in this project, I approached it with Daniela Rosner's vision of interaction design, where she takes a critical stand on the values that underlie the mainstream design practices, and she tries to promote alternative discourses. So about my design process, I was structured in 3 parts: first the fieldwork, then prototyping, and then analysis. So about the fieldwork, I first conducted interviews with dysfunctional devices users. I conducted interviews with 6 participants who owned various dysfunctional devices. The idea was to explore the effects of decreased functionalities of devices, which are also generally associated to obsolescence. Oops. And what was interesting here was that because of external causes and because of how their social environment is structured, it became socially difficult not to have a functioning device for them at some point. And also for half of them, it was economical reasons that pushed them to postpone buying or repairing their device. Um, then I conducted an interview with a person who chose to live without a smartphone in Sweden. So he used to live with burner phone and what he calls a Nokia phone, and now has been living without any phone for 4 months. And so I asked him, and so what he said is that according to him, the improvements on his mental health worth the complication on his daily life. However, he said that he observed that he faces additional difficulties due to this very specific situation in a Swedish environment. Um, and I also conducted a probe experiment with two participants who were given for one burner phone that you can see on pictures here, and the other one chose not to have any phone because she didn't see the point in having a phone with no internet on it. So the idea here was to explore the adaptation process when one switches from their own device, their contemporary one, to an obsolete one. So they experienced it like a digital detox, like a positive experience. And but what I could see is that they rearranged their planning beforehand. So they postponed their important calls and activities and meetings to the next week. From there, I made a shift because I thought that maybe there was a soft bias in the selection of the participants for several reasons. And that I don't think that the use of obsolete devices is always pleasant or fashionable. And I actually thought of the people who struggle in their lives because they don't have a choice and they can't just buy a new one when they are bored. Um, so now I'm going to present the other part of my fieldwork, which is more focused on the observation of Swedish public services, the ones I presented earlier. So this one is it's called trafficking. I went in the city to observe the infrastructure there and what information was available at bus stops for commuters, for people. What I could see is that the information is very inconsistent. And so, for example, if you don't have a good knowledge of the transportation infrastructure in Malmö, it might be difficult, for example, to make routes or to make connections on the spots. In parallel, I was exploring the mobile bank ID technology. So I don't have one, which makes it even easier to explore. So I made two color experiments. So the first one was with the public healthcare, and I was trying to get an appointment for blood sampling. It took me 2 days. So you can see here that I mapped the experiment. It was a lot of waiting on hold, but also the most of the part was being redirected in between different numbers and services all the time. I also made the second calling experiment with Skatteverket, the tax agency, but because I didn't have any credit left for calls on my phone, I couldn't finish the experiment and I couldn't even reach anyone. Yeah, and I also mapped the experience of the blogger that she depicted online on her blog. And she was trying to make an appointment to a doctor because she was sick. Um, and actually, she had to wait for the end of the day to get to a drop-in appointment because she couldn't, she gave up on the calls and trying to reach someone directly. Yeah, so now I'm going to quickly go through my prototyping. So my initial sketches that I'm not going to go deeply into right now, they were inspired from pre-existing technology that's called offline internet that existed in India in 2014 because there were 700 million phones that were not connected to internet at the time. And this enabled the phones to, through text messages, to access to online contents. Basically. I kept this technology on my first prototype, which is a text message based trafficking app somehow. So this is the first tree structure of the different conversations, the different paths that one can make in the service, the text message based service. So I then prototyped a little chatbot that enable that aimed at first to make the experience as concise as possible because of the size of the screen, but also about the inputs because of the keyboards that might not be very convenient. And I tested it with two participants, who had the great idea to implement shortcuts, which are a string of characters for people who already know what they want in the service, and so they don't have to go through all the conversation before, for example, getting tickets. Um, then I did a real life situation testing in a Wizard of Oz setting. I was the server, and I was answering the questions following the script of this tree structure of the participants who was actually really making a trip in Malmö. And her feedback was that she wanted more options and parameters, which is kind of tricky for me here because it's hard to find a balance between this personalized interaction and a concise experience, I said before. So this is a sketch of the service. It's showing the different exchanges between the server and the user through the phone. So this is the second prototype. This is what I call the phone book. So for this one, I based myself first on the observations that I made from my current experiments, and I proposed three happy paths, happy journeys for getting in contact with Swedish healthcare. So the idea was to save time there. And I created shortcuts at the beginning of each scenario, which are just like before a string, but this time of numbers that added the different personal information that you have about yourself, because you are supposed to enter them anyways when you call. And also that redirect you directly where you want, so you don't have to go through several menus and listen to everything before going where you want. Um, And so these shortcuts would be found in a phone book that would be distributed to each home. So when you move in, on each book there's an identification number, which you combine to your own phone number. And this is a sort of authentication process for safety for your personal information when you kind of connect to the service, just like an ID. Um, so this is a sketch of the authentication process with phonebook. On one side, you have how you set up the the identity, how you connect it to your phone number, and on the other side, you have how, for example, here you make an appointment in Swedish healthcare, but there could be a lot of other applications. Um, so I made a short analysis on the digitalization processes that I observed in my case study according to the different actors that are involved in provoking obsolescence. So the first direction is from progressive experiences to instantaneous experiences. The second one is from localized interactions to ubiquitous interactions. And the last one goes from fragmentary information to specific information. So what is interesting to me here is that my prototypes, if I try to look at them here, they would be located closer to the most recent tendencies. So this might be questionable, of course, but also I think it reveals that adapting all the devices to new infrastructures means using them differently. So for my main contributions of my work would be on the side of public service design, as it argues for acknowledging the responsibility of public institutions in the normalization of emerging technologies at big scale. I also propose a revisited version of sacred bending, which initially aims to give to all the technologies new potentials. So here I take the expression in the opposite way, by bending the environments of obsolete devices to them. So further developments would be including directly in the design process marginalized groups by technological progress. What that was a bit difficult to make during the coronavirus pandemic here. Um, Also, I think that would be interesting to reflect on the potential complexification of public services due to all those new offers, for example, a new phone book and some pre-existing complex public services. and in a more general way, enlarging the reflections around obsolescence outside the scope of public services and extending it to instruction design in general. Thank you.